Good evening. Let's let a few more people in. Good. Good evening. Hi, I'm Andy Silow-Carroll of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and the New York Jewish Week. And I want to welcome everyone to our discussion, sponsored by JTA, with Benjamin Balint. Our talk today is part of an ongoing series of discussions with creators, writers, and artists in the Jewish world. And we're glad to have all of you on this call. Thanks for joining. Our guest today, Ben Balint, is sort of creating his own genre of literary nonfiction. Call it the life, death, and afterlife of the 20th century's most influential Jewish authors. In his previous book, Kafka's Last Trial, he wrote about how Franz Kafka's archives ended up at the National Library of Israel, thanks to Max Brod, a friend of Kafka's who promised he would burn the writer's work after his death in the 1920s. We know he didn't, and therein lies the tale. And now in his latest book, Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History, Ben writes about another enormously influential Eastern European Jewish writer and artist, his life in what became Ukraine, his death at the hands of the Nazis, and the afterlife of what has become one of his iconic works. Like the Kafka book, Bruno Schulz is part biography and part detective story. To introduce Ben Balint, I'll note that Kafka's Last Trial won the 2020 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. He's a library fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, from where he joins us tonight. It's quite early in the morning there. He's the co-author with Mirav Mak of Jerusalem, City of the Book, and the author of Running Commentary, A History of the Influential Jewish Magazine of Ideas and Neoconservatism. Ben, thanks so much for joining us to talk about Bruno Schulz.
Thank you, Andy, for hosting me, and thanks to each and every one of you out there in the comfort of your living rooms for joining us this evening.
So let me start by introducing Schulz to audiences who may not be familiar with his life or his legacy. Where is he from? What is he best known for? Who is this man?
Well, Bruno Schulz once said that he lived as an Austrian, a Pole, and a Jew, sometimes in the space of a single afternoon. His life began under the banner of the Austro-Hungarian double-headed eagle and ended in the genocidal bloodlands, to use Timothy Snyder's term, of the German occupation of Galicia. So he was born in 1892 in a small town in then Polish Galicia. And his life was really at a crossroads, not just of, I would say, Jewish and Polish culture, but also, as we'll speak about, of art, eroticism, and violence. Both, we should say, as a graphic artist and as a writer, as a master of 20th century imaginative fiction, who to this day is considered to be the most powerful of writers who wrote in Polish in the 20th century.
So I actually read for the first time, I admit, The Street of the Crocodiles, as it's known in English. He's known for two slim collections of short stories, connected stories. Street of the Crocodiles, Under the Hourglass. You can give the full title. Is that pretty much? And you have an index of some longer works, but his literary reputation now in the West is mostly based on those two books.
Yeah, that's right. A very slim and slender group of interlocked short stories over the two books that you mentioned, both of which were published in the 1930s and sort of instantly vaulted him to the heights of Polish life and letters. Of course, he also had a day job, which is that beginning in 1924, he was a teacher in the same high school that he himself attended in Drohobych, mostly of arts and crafts and woodworking and things like that.
Hmm. Now, his artwork, he was also a graphic artist, a fine artist. His artwork and his writing were distinct in different ways. The drawings and paintings often circled around his sadomasochistic fantasies, while his writing exists in a sort of, I describe it as a dreamscape. And those dreams are part of an almost theology of his own making. There are Jewish references, but we think of him as a Jewish writer. And I think that's going to become important as we discuss his life and his legacy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that ties together both the graphic and the literary side of his creativity is how rooted he was in Drohobych specifically and in Galicia in a larger sense. So remember that his home province of Galicia, and I should mention that my own grandmother hailed a generation later from the same part of the world, as did Joseph Roth, as did Shai Agnon. They're all from this very small orbit. And what makes it so interesting is that it was this place of fluctuating boundaries. And I think that at the heart of Schulz's artwork is a kind of blurring of boundaries, sometimes between animal and human, between animate and inanimate objects, between instinct and intellect, and between myth and the sharp contours of reality. All of this reflects itself in what you called his dreamlike vision of the world. And all of it is deeply rooted in this town that he felt incapable for most of his life from leaving.
Right. I was going to ask about that because I had a sense he's this funny combination of provincial, like you said, he rarely ventures behind Drohobych, and worldly. He seems to have he was corresponding with other literary figures of the day.
That's right. I mean, he was published by the best publishers in Warsaw. He was corresponding with Thomas Mann. He was translating, the first translator of Franz Kafka into Polish. So he was, to a degree, part of those circles. At the same time, he always held himself apart. He always refused invitations to move to Warsaw, to really join those circles fully. And I think that's part of the reason is that Drohobych was such a integral nourishment of what he needed. And for him, it was also not just a nourishment, but a place where he spent his childhood. And as you and I talked about in a previous conversation over the phone, childhood was as important of a theme to him as was this blurring of boundaries. He has this beautiful phrase that he says, "My ideal is to mature into childhood." He had this fantasy of sort of to achieving a repeated childhood. And he calls that, if we could realize that, the limitlessness of childhood, that would be the Messianic times. That would usher in the Messianic times. So the scenes, and then I should add one more thing, right? Which is that most of his stories are narrated by a child narrator named Joseph, who grows up as the stories unfold, from a very young boy to an adolescent. They're told through the prism of a child narrator. And so the child sees this town through the prism of this childlike wonder. And that wonder is also part of, or at the heart of Schulz's art.
Tell us about life before and after the Nazis invade Poland. Does his life change abruptly, or is it a slower process? And maybe at this point, we might have an image of Drohobych we could display to give people a sense.
Yeah, why don't we actually pull up number 2, the image that we had of that we listed as number 2, if we could. And this image that we're about to see is an etching of the market square in Drohobych, which looks virtually unchanged today. The etching is by a famous Drohobych-born artist, Ephraim Lilien, who later came to Jerusalem and was one of the founders of the Bezalel Art School. But he did this etching around the time of Schulz's birth. And the house on the right there is the house where the Schulzes lived over there in the floor above their textile shop. His parents were textile merchants. And he grew up, in the store with mannequins and all kinds of colorful fabrics. So that's the scene of his childhood. And if we could go back, I think one image, while we're already looking at images, to the first image, we'll see a classic image of Bruno Schulz on the steps of his home in Drohobych before the war. That's him with a notebook on his lap. I was able to visit this house, still stands very much unchanged. I was able to visit this before the Ukraine war broke out. Drohobych is now, talking about fluctuating boundaries, it's now part of Western Ukraine. It's now southwest of Lviv. So in a sense, yes, to get back to your question, his life did change quite abruptly, in the sense that Drohobych before the war was very multilingual, multicultural. People used to call it, with mathematical unprecision, 1.5 cities. They would say it's 1/2 Jewish, 1/2 Polish, 1/2 Ukrainian. In actual fact, to be more mathematically accurate about it, it was about 40% Jewish, 30% Polish, 30% Ukrainian. Of course, all of that vanishes with the rupture of the Second World War. So in that sense alone, that's the great, breaking point in Schulz's life. He and his family had to leave the house that we just saw and were herded into a ghetto in 1941.
Okay. And then is he able to continue creating? Is he writing during this time? Is he leaving, like other people did, diaries of life under occupation?
We have no diaries, but we have his letters. And to a certain extent, he writes that letters were one of the great sources and expressions of his creativity. They're beautiful in and of themselves. And he is not publishing during the war, but instead he is very quickly made destitute. And he had to parcel out, first of all, he had to sell his artworks, his engravings, his paintings. Only one of his paintings survives the war. We can look at that too. It's image number 3 that we had before, an image called Encounter, which is set against the backdrop of Drohobych. He also parcels out his manuscripts. One of the parcels contains a novel that he's working on. The title, poignantly enough, is called The Messiah, and it has never been found. It's one of the great literary mysteries. Cynthia Ozick wrote a whole novel called The Messiah of Stockholm, just about this mystery of what happened to Bruno Schulz's Messiah. This painting that we're seeing now is, as I mentioned, the only one that of Schulz's paintings that survived, although hundreds of his drawings did. And it's fairly typical in the sense that there's a man kind of genuflecting towards 2 women who are barely giving him, the time of day. This is fairly a typical Schulzian theme, and it's set against an idealized cityscape in the background of Drohobych itself. So back to your question again, the only thing that he's really creating during the war is coerced art, which is a fascinating category to me in and of itself. Art under coercion. What does it mean to be coerced to to paint, for example, which is exactly what he was forced to do. And what happened is that in 1941, a Austrian-born SS officer named Felix Landau, essentially Schulz's more masochistic artworks seem to have caught Landau's eye, and Landau fancied himself to be a man of, refined taste, and he essentially became Schulz's guardian devil. Schulz's art became the currency with which he bought life. In other words, he became the pet artist of this particular officer. He was forced to, make portraits of Gestapo officers' mistresses. He was forced to do murals on various Nazi buildings in Drohobych. And the last thing that he did before he died was Landau coerced him to paint fairy tale scenes for the children's room of the SS officers' two children who were just 2 and 4 at that time.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to, these murals are going to be the center of the detective story that's about to follow. I do want to mention something about Felix Landau. We have a personal and institutional connection. Thea Wieseltier, who helped set up this event tonight, and at 70 Faces Media, helps plan these events. Her mother was a maid, I understand, in the house of Felix Landau, one of her few family members to survive the war. And I guess she had a firsthand. You talked to, I think, Thea's brother about her firsthand experience with this fairly monstrous Gestapo officer.
Yeah, I mean, this officer Landau was first of all involved in. He was from Vienna, and after the Anschluss in 1938, was directly involved in supervising the repatriation and theft of various Jewish properties and art collections. So, if any of you have read The Woman in Gold about the stolen Klimt painting. That's Felix Landau, but he accumulated such a reputation for brutality that he was even among his peers, that he was sent to this easternmost province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Galicia, to get him sort of out of the way, and where he kind of appointed himself. He called himself the general of the Jews. So yes, he was quite a monstrous character, but again, a monstrous character who fancied himself to be a patron of the arts.
Mm-hmm. So you have a number of accounts. There are a number of accounts of the death of Bruno Schulz, and you include, I think, you include them all in your book in a sort of Rashomon effect. What's the most definitive account? What do we know about how he died, who murdered him, and where he's buried and all that?
Well, shortly after he is forced to paint these children's fairy tale scenes, there was an incident where called Black Thursday, November 19th, 1942. By a tragic irony of fate, this was the very day that Bruno Schulz had planned to escape from the Drohobych ghetto with forged so-called Aryan papers. He always hesitated to leave. Friends tried to get him out. Finally, he agreed, and his escape date was planned for November 19th. On that very day, there was a so-called Gestapo action, and Felix Landau had earlier that month shot a Jewish dentist who had been forced to work for another German officer named Karl Gunther. He was under his protection, so to speak. And on November 19th, Karl Gunther spotted Schulz at a junction not 100 yards from the house where Schulz was born. Schulz was on his way to pick up some bread for the family and had a loaf of bread tucked under his arm. And Gunther shot him at point blank range. Schulz was then 50 years old. Gunther left his body where it lay in the street. And sometime later, the Gestapo officers met for lunch, where Gunther told Felix Landau, "You had killed my Jew, I've now killed yours." That's the most chilling account of the murder of Bruno Schulz. It's one that David Grossman, the Israeli novelist, has adopted. Some of you may have read Grossman's novel, which features Bruno Schulz, Sea Under Love, which was published in 1986. And his grave has never been found.
And just to remind people, it was not Landau who kills him, it is Gunther.
Right.
Right. So that's just a small distinction, but maybe one worth making. So to fast forward a bit, is it fair to say that as a result and after the Holocaust, his work is largely forgotten and then there's a revival? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? We'll get to the murals in a minute, but tell us a little bit about that. And I know that Philip Roth played a large role in bringing back Bruno Schulz to the Western canon.
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, so after the war, Drohobych, along with the rest of Western Ukraine, becomes part of Western Ukraine. And the richness and diversity of life disappears. And Drohobych becomes a Ukrainian town, and a Ukrainian-speaking town exclusively. Meanwhile, in communist Poland, post-war Poland, Schulz's works do not meet with much favor from the official censors who wish to impose a kind of socialist, realist mode of fiction. I can't think of anything less socialist, realist than the fiction of Bruno Schulz. So his writing was suppressed, and even in his native Polish was not published until the so-called Stalinist thaw in the 50s. Meanwhile, in his hometown, nobody's reading him because nobody's reading Polish, and it takes decades for him to be translated into Ukrainian. Since, I should say, this revival, starting in the late 80s, Schulz has been translated into more than 40 languages. But in those early decades, you're absolutely correct, which is that there was this amnesia effect, multiple amnesias, I would say. Part of that changes due to the writer that you just mentioned, Philip Roth, who had an extremely influential series of Penguin paperbacks called Writers from the Other Europe. And Philip Roth, if he had never written a single novel, I think would be to be commended greatly just for publishing this series. He's the one who brought Schulz, Milan Kundera, Danilo Kish, all these people into the English-speaking public. And after that, a whole new generation of people becomes fascinated with Schulz and venerate Schulz as a kind of guiding spirit. So I mentioned already David Grossman. I mentioned Cynthia Ozick, also in the mid-'80s, writes The Messiah of Stockholm around the Schulz legend. Philip Roth himself has a Schulz-like character in his book, The Prague Orgy, going in search of a Schulz-like character. In Germany, a writer named Maxim Biller gets in on the act. He writes a novella called Inside the Head of Bruno Schulz, which is essentially about the Schulz-Thomas Mann connection. And then in our own day, Jonathan Safran Foer becomes a a fellow Schulz obsessive and takes the two slim volumes of Schulz's fiction that you mentioned, Andrew, and creates a new book by cutting out, speaking of the politics of erasure, literally cutting out sentences and words and phrases from Schulz to create a new story. And that book is called The Tree of Codes. And you can see inside, literally taking out, sentences to create new meanings from Schulz. So there's a great deal of renewed interest in Schulz in both in his hometown and throughout the world. I met when I was in Drohobych in 2020 a woman who learned Polish, a Japanese woman who learned Polish for the sole reason of translating Schulz into Japanese, for example. So now there's this Schulz Fest brings in international visitors every 2 years to Drohobych, a flock of people who call themselves Schulzoids or Schulzologists. And as I say, he's been translated into 40 languages.
So the Schulz revival is happening before these famous murals are discovered. Tell us about where they're found, what was the state of these murals, and we'll eventually get to how they ended up in Israel.
So now we fast forward to the end of the Cold War, and now we're in February 2001, and a pair of stepfather and son of German filmmakers from Hamburg, named Benjamin and Christian Geisler, managed to do a lot of detective work, and they found that the villa where Felix Landau had lived with his family had been apportioned to separated into different apartments and apportioned in Soviet style to various apparatchiks after the war. And they had found in one apartment the likely place of Schulz's murals, not knowing if they still existed. And they knocked on the door of the Kaluzhny family. And one thing led to another. The old children's room had since been painted over and was used as a kitchen pantry for decades. And the filmmakers got permission from the Ukrainian family to take down the jars of the pickles and the clumps of garlic and the various canned foods, and were able to bring in an expert team to take off the outer layer of paint. And lo and behold, they are able to recover the original murals that had been lost for more than 60 years of these fairy tale scenes. What transpired after that is that they wished to make a museum in honor of Bruno Schulz based around these murals. They informed the Polish Ministry of Culture, the German Minister of Culture, the Ukrainian Minister of Culture, and last but perhaps most mistakenly, Yad Vashem. And 3 months later, that May, Yad Vashem, with the help of the Mossad, sent a team of 3 Israeli agents, and through a combination of bribery and spycraft and the diplomatic immunity of then Israeli ambassador to Poland, Shevach Weiss, spent a night chiseling off 5 fragments of these murals, which occupied 3 walls of the pantry, and smuggling them across the Ukrainian-Polish border and then back to Yad Vashem. And the last part of my book, as you mentioned, yes, thank you. This is one of the fragments that's now in Yad Vashem. And the last part of my book sort of tells the story of how this repatriation of the murals, if you want to call it that, or rescue or removal, really went to the heart. It became a scandal and went to the heart of European Jewish memory. and the question of who has the right to curate that memory.
It's an incredible story, and these are large chunks of, I guess, plaster, not something you can just take in a suitcase and get through customs. So I guess there's an implication that whatever the Mossad does or whatever Israel does, they were able to bribe their way back, all the way back to Jerusalem. Is that pretty clear?
Yeah, several things are clear. One is that very large bribes were given. Second is that various international treaties on the removal of art were violated. Third, it's clear that in its defense, Yad Vashem did not make a legal defense, but rather asserted what they called a moral right, right? And you and I, again, in our phone conversation, mentioned also the Eichmann case, right? It's kind of a kidnapping of these murals, in which legal niceties are put aside for the purpose of this repatriation. I think that the Israelis sort of felt, well, first of all, if you want to ask to which nation or country or cartography does Bruno Schulz belong, that is to say, does it belong to Poland, Ukraine, Israel, or cultural heritage as such, they would say, oh, it's pretty obvious that Schulz's murals and legacy would speak more eloquently, would speak more widely in Yad Vashem, which draws about 1 million visitors a year, than they would in Drohobych, the town where Schulz spent his entire life, but which had also relegated him to near oblivion, right? So that was the Israeli point of view. Many years of negotiation after this scandal ensued, and Yad Vashem was able to put them on display for the first time only in 2009. It happened to be that that 2 weeks after they put them on display in 2009, Yad Vashem received a rather prominent visitor, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and I published in my book a wonderful photograph of her marveling at the Schulz murals that were just newly unveiled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we talk about the Eichmann case, I guess the stakes, not just for Israel, but for the inheritors of whatever the legacy of the Holocaust is, whether that's Poland or Ukraine as collaborators, or for the Jewish community, it becomes a question: what claim does Israel have on the Holocaust? Is it, they are the next chapter in the Jewish story, so they belong, or they own the story of the Holocaust? That's kind of a theme in your book. It goes back to Hannah Arendt writing about the Eichmann trial. Does Israel have that moral claim that you spoke about before?
Yeah, look, I mean, I spoke to Yehuda Bauer about Bruno Schulz, the dean of Israeli Holocaust scholars. And he told me, look, some people now find it fashionable to universalize Schulz, to find in him a symbol of universal artistic genius, to see in him a representative of Central European culture, etc. But what Bauer said to me is that the cause of Schulz's death, after all, is really not far to seek. Because Schulz was murdered as a Jew, not because of his Polish citizenship. In the eyes of his Polish contemporaries, he was a Jew, not a Pole, whatever his personal views might have been. And therefore, this provides justification for his legacy to be kept at Yad Vashem. I also asked Cynthia Ozek the same question. I asked her about what her opinion was on what I called the justice of this ingathering of fragments. I used the word ingathering with her because of this notion of a larger cultural, what the Israelis call kinus, which means an ingathering not just of people, not just of exiles, not just of refugees, but an ingathering of material heritage. And she answered, she said, I'll quote it here, she said, my instinct, which is more primitive than moonings over justice, insists that Europe has never deserved and never will deserve the presence of Jews or the work of their hands and their minds. So in a funny way, sort of Yehuda Bauer coming from the Israeli point of view and Cynthia Ozick coming from her own rather low opinion of what Europe has deserved coincide on this point, and support the fact that, you know, Jerusalem sees itself as the culmination of the Jewish story, even especially when that story is a diaspora story. So you mentioned earlier the case of Kafka's manuscripts. It's a very similar case in this respect. Kafka is, I mean, it's hard to imagine a more diasporic writer. So Kafka's writing in German, Schulz is writing in Polish, and yet in both cases, the state, the Jewish state, is making moral claims on and insisting that their story culminates here in Jerusalem, right? Or at the very least is better protected here. Now, I also spoke to the remaining Jews in Drohobych. There are still Jews there. And many of them felt that this was a great insight. This is one of them, you see on your screens right now, named Leonid Goldberg, a wonderful man, who is also the keykeeper to the absolutely marvelous choral synagogue in Drohobych, which took 23 years to build, and was in 2018 magnificently restored. And Goldberg and others told me, if Yad Vashem feels that the work of Jewish hands cannot be protected in what's now Ukraine, then what does that say about their opinion of living Jews themselves? So that's, you know, the Drohobych point of view.
At this point, I want to urge people on the call, if you do have a question, you can drop them into the chat. I'll get to as many as I can. There are already a few I see. I'll ask one of them, which is, someone asked, was the murderer of was Schulz's murderer or Landau brought to justice?
I have a chapter on that in the book. The short answer is only partially. Felix Landau escaped justice. He changed his name. He moved to Bavaria after the war and became an interior designer, again, pointing to his pretensions of artistic taste. However, in the early 60s, he wanted to remarry. To do so, he had to register under his real name. There was a warrant out for his arrest. He was arrested. Unlike Bruno Schulz, Felix Landau kept a meticulous diary of the war years. That diary was crucial in prosecuting him. The diary is an unbelievable document in and of itself. I quote it in the book because it mixes sentimentality towards his mistress with whom he lived and later married, with absolutely matter-of-fact brutality about the mass killings he was involved in. So on the strength of the diary, which was authenticated, he was convicted in a court in Stuttgart, Germany. I interviewed several people who were involved in testifying against him. Imagine that you are a survivor from Drohobych. You end up, in one case, in Beersheva. The last place you ever want to go back to is either Poland or Germany. You're creating a new life for yourself, and then you get a phone call, and in 1961, we need you to come back to testify and to face this criminal. Many of them did, at great emotional and psychological cost. And to make a long story short, he was convicted, but served only 10 years, then was granted a full pardon, and lived another 10 years as a free man, and died as a free man.
Your book, and I have to recommend your book to whoever goes out, and you hope they do, buys your book. Your footnotes, in some ways, are a whole nother book in themselves. They're fascinating, and they also show the kind of the extent of your whole research project. Tell us a little bit about that. What were some of the obstacles? What were some of the great finds as you set out to do this book?
Well, the most moving parts of the research for me were first interviewing children of survivors from Drohobych, and people who testified against Felix Landau, reading accounts of his students, all of whom were enthralled by him, not because he was great at teaching arts and crafts or woodworking, but because more frequently than teaching, he would simply tell stories. And many of the students were absolutely enthralled by his storytelling extemporaneous abilities. Second most moving was going to Drohobych personally, as I mentioned, going to his house, going to that shul, meeting with the existing community. And third, I was able to find original documents in the Vienna city.
We lost you 1 second there, Ben.
Sorry, am I still there?
Yeah, you're fine. Go ahead.
That related to the prosecution of Landau, and some of this has never been seen, but some of these documents have never really been seen before and never been published before. So yeah, I mean, the way I look at footnotes, and I think I have far too many in the book, is that, you know, if you read a book and if a book is like a motor car and you want to, pick up the hood and see what's under the hood, look at the engine, then that's what those are for. This is yours, like as I mentioned in the introduction, this is your second book of sort of looking at the conflicted legacy of a writer, his archives, his belongings, his work. Where did your interest in this sort of literary detective story come from? Well, it originated first as an interest in what it means to write as a Jew in a diaspora language. My first book, as you mentioned, was a biography, not of a single person, but of a group of people who were gathered around Commentary magazine. And essentially, it was a story of what it is to write in English as an American. The second book has to do with what the meaning of writing in German, as was the case of Kafka. And the third now is the meaning of writing in this diasporic language, Polish. I should mention that Isaac Bashevis Singer was also an ardent admirer of Bruno Schulz. He said that Schulz is one of the most remarkable writers who ever lived. Had he lived longer, he would have given us even more untold treasures. At the same time, Singer, in a conversation with Philip Roth, admits that he never read Schulz until he came to New York. The reason being is that there was this huge schism in the Jewish community in Poland between those who wrote and read in Polish and those like Singer who wrote and read in Yiddish. And he says to Roth, speaking of diasporic languages, Polish was for us a diasporic and foreign language. My family had been in Warsaw for God knows how many generations, and my father spoke a grand total of 2 words of Polish. So he had no access to Schulz until he came to this other diaspora, namely the shores of New York. So would he have
read him in English or Polish? originally?
I think in the end he must have read him in English, and that's how he came to Roth. That was their joint interest in publishing Bruno Schulz in English. So that to me is even before we get to the sort of fun of the detective work, there's that question that I think is binding many of these cases together. Not just what it means to write from the margins. Kafka certainly thought of himself as writing from the margins. Schulz was literally and geographically writing from the margins, although he thought actually Galicia was the center. I'm not writing, he didn't adopt the view from Vienna that Galicia was some backwater. What does it mean to write it from the margins? What does it mean to write as an American Jew, as a German-speaking Jew, as a Polish-speaking Jew, and the affinities thereof? And then this issue of the repatriation. What does it mean? How does a country, a state, try to shore up its own legitimacy by appropriating artists, by saying this artist belongs to this or that nationality? Bashevis Singer also says something else. He said every writer and every piece of writing has an address. There's no such thing as international literature. The question is, what is that address? What happens if you want to repatriate a writer whose patria no longer exists? After all, it's no fault of Israel's that Schulz's homeland no longer exists. The German-speaking world of Kafka's Prague no longer exists. Not because of anything that Israel, was involved in. So, in that sense, I became very interested in these questions of repatriating the cultural legacy when the patria itself no longer exists. What does that say about cultural memory, recovering the memory that has been erased or suppressed? And ultimately, what does it mean about how Israel sees itself vis-a-vis diaspora culture?
Thanks. So I'm going to take a few of the audience questions now. Someone asked, just going back to the murals a sec, what happened to the remnants that remained in Drohobych? Are they being protected? Are they part of a museum?
Yes, so Yad Vashem chose to take 5 scenes back, 5 fragments, and they left smaller fragments in Drohobych. Those were also removed, protected, conserved, and are now occupy a room in the Drohobych City Museum dedicated to Schulz. One day, maybe all of the fragments will be reunited. For the time being, they are still separate.
There was talk of turning the villa into some kind of a Schulz museum. I don't think.
Yes, there were plans. There was fundraising. There was an idea. Oh, finally, we should recognize this hometown hero. Those plans lasted exactly 3 months between the discovery of the murals and the time that the Israeli agents took them. By which time such a museum could not be realized.
Is there some statue or marker in the town recognizing that he was one of their own?
Yes, every November 19th, on the art site of Bruno Schulz, there's an ecumenical service at the spot where he was shot. I attended it in November 2020. Kaddish is recited, and there's a small bronze plaque in his memory in the sidewalk where this tragedy took place. That is a replica. The bronze plaque is a replica because several years ago, the original commemorative plaque was stolen by a local for scrap metal. It was since broken up, and I saw the fragments, and now there's a replica there. I should add one more thing about that replica, since you asked about it. It's a very modest, as I say, plaque embedded in the sidewalk, easy to miss. Just behind it, there's a municipal park. In the middle of that park is a prominent statue on top of a pedestal, almost in grotesque proximity to the Schulz plaque. And it's a statue of Stepan Bandera, the ultra right-wing Ukrainian nationalist who also collaborated with the Nazis in the Second World War. So that gives you some idea of the complications of memory in a place like Drohobych.
Someone asked, we all know, we think of Ukraine, we know there's a war there now. Has Drohobych been spared? As far as you know?
Drohobych, because it's so far to the west, almost on the Polish border, has been spared. But there's a great deal of concern about cultural property now. And that gives a whole new accent to this question of where is cultural heritage better preserved, right? In a sense, I had the sense that people at Yad Vashem now think that the war in Ukraine only strengthens their arguments because it shows the precariousness of cultural heritage under threat. So far, not in Drohobych and not yet in Lviv. But yes, cultural heritage is under threat. There's been widespread looting in eastern Ukraine of museums and cultural sites, and sandbagging museums, and
Someone else asks, earlier you had quoted Leonid Goldberg, I believe, with a rhetorical question, and one of our viewers asked, please clarify exactly what he might have meant with his rhetorical question.
I'm not sure I remember what the rhetorical... it wasn't his rhetorical question. It was a woman who belongs to the Jewish community there. And her question, if I remember correctly, was, if Yad Vashem has come to the conclusion that we are not to be trusted as guardians of our own Jewish heritage, then what does that say about living Jews? In other words, they felt a great sense of insult that the message that the Israelis were giving them in removing these murals was essentially, neither you nor your heritage have a place here. You have a history, but you have no future.
I'm also struck, I think a lot of people are, about, Kafka and Schulz are sometimes mentioned in the same sentence. I guess people see Eastern European, Jewish, somewhat fabulist in their styles. I guess that's been, those comparisons have been made frequently. Obviously, I don't think the two were not contemporaries. Kafka died much earlier. But are those comparisons fair? Where do they fail? Where do they succeed?
Well, in my opinion, the literary styles cannot be more different. Schulz's sentences are long and sensuous and full of color, where Kafka's tend towards the spareness of style. Some themes, though, they do share. The preoccupation with the father, the preoccupation of the son and the father, what is passed on, what is transmitted from father to son, is a great preoccupation of both. There's the blurring of the animal and the human that I mentioned earlier. So metamorphosis also shows up not just in Kafka's Gregor Samsa, but also in Bruno Schulz, who imagines in one story that the father turns into a cockroach, and in another story, the father turns into a crab, which the mother serves for a very treif dinner. So there's a certain surreal, fantastical element to both, even where the styles really diverge. And there's a certain, writing from the margins, I would say, that both are very self-conscious of.
Terrific. Well, I just want to remind people the name of the book is Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History. It's available wherever you get your fine books. I want to thank Benjamin Balint for taking this time. It is Israel where he is, so it's quite early in the morning. And so thank you for staying up for us. I also want to thank Mira Zalali, Theo Wieseltier, and Becky Phillips of the 70 Faces staff for putting together this Jewish Telegraphic Agency event. Ben, I can give you the last word if there's anything we left out. But otherwise, I just want to thank you for a terrific event.
I'll just say as a last word that this multi-ethnic patchwork called Galicia that Schulz made home has long since ceased to be. But in a certain sense, I would say, Bruno Schulz created his own small homeland, the homeland of the imagination, what he calls in another place, the Republic of Dreams. And that's a place that we all have access to. And I would highly recommend reading, there's a fantastic recent translation of all of Bruno Schulz's stories by Madeleine Levine. And those of you who haven't read Schulz, I think you'll be amazed and enthralled.
Terrific. Ben, thanks so much for the time. Thank everyone for joining us, and we'll see you soon on another program. Good night.
Thanks so much.